Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast, recorded on stage at CDMO Live Europe 2026 in Rotterdam. This episode is sponsored by PharmaBlock, a fully integrated CRDMO providing research, development and manufacturing services from early discovery to commercial production.
Simtra BioPharma Solutions spun out of Baxter just 2 years ago, and since then has put over $500 million into building mirrored injectable manufacturing capabilities on 2 continents. So our next guest is the person responsible for turning that investment into commercial reality. Mike Schaefers is CCO and Head of Business Development at Simtra, with a career spanning West Pharmaceutical Services, Ionova and LTS Lohmann. He joins me to talk about what it actually takes to build a CDMO partnership that holds up under pressure and where the injectable market is really heading. So thanks for joining me, Mike. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
So tell me, Simtra has now been an independent, privately owned company for over 2 years. How is that different operating as a standalone CDMO?
Yeah, I would say it really helps you to focus on the key elements of your business and your strategy, because you can be really laser focused on what you want to accomplish as a business. And that is, for us at Simtra, it's basically providing injectable drug products to clients and finally patients in the world. That means from our side, in order to execute this strategy, we needed to invest significantly, as you mentioned, in order to provide sufficient capacity to our clients in 2 regions, North America and Europe in particular. But in addition to that, you also need to invest, of course, in the right talent. You need to run the sites, you need to have appropriate customer service teams, project management teams, etc., to drive really a great customer experience.
Great, yeah. So let's talk about that investment a bit more then. So building matching capabilities in both the US and Europe. So what's driving that?
Yeah, I think people talk a lot about the new geopolitical situation. I would say there are basically 2 underlying factors. Of course, there's a lot of, noise around this geopolitical situation, but on the other side, there's also a big effort by pharma and biotech companies to de-risk the business and de-risk the supply chain. And in order to do so, it's very beneficial to have basically a CDMO that can provide solutions in the 2 main continents, primarily US and Europe. And when I say that, this means, you can offer to clients in both regions development services, you can offer clinical batch manufacturing, you can offer commercial manufacturing, so that the customer really has a choice on where he wants to go based on his specific situation to de-risk his business.
Great. So how are client conversations about regional manufacturing actually changing in recent years?
Yeah, I think there's a very big trend from my perspective to have manufacturing in the region for the region, which means if your prime market is North America, there's a tendency to have more manufacturing in North America and vice versa.
Why do you think that is? Is that a new conversation? This EU for EU, US for US, China for China, is this something that's come up in the last few years, or has this always been the case?
No, I think it has intensified over the last couple of years. I would say it even goes back to the COVID times, where people understood how fragile supply chains can be, and that created a stronger trend to look into, a supply out of the region for this region.
So do you think this is a permanent shift region to region?
No, I think it's there to stay. And I would say there are basically 2 underlying factors. We talked about de-risking the supply chain. I think the other element is also looking at cost management. And if the production in the domestic region can support these 2 elements, it will always be beneficial for a client to do so. And if, like us, there's a CDMO that can provide these 2 alternatives, I think it's definitely worth for every client to explore that.
Let's talk about some of Simtra's speciality, which is injectables. It's no secret that demand for high-potency injectables is outpacing capacity across the industry.
Yeah.
How do you decide where to place your bets in this space?
Yeah. I think you mentioned that Simtra is now 2 years an independent company, but I would say our experience, our capabilities, our capacities and manufacturing skills go back decades prior to that. So we're not founded and just 2 years in the business. There's a longer history. And there's also a longer history and relationship with all leading pharma biotech clients. And when you're so closely connected to these clients, you get signals on where the market is heading. On top of that, we also do, of course, our homework in terms of market research. So we study industry reports. We go to conferences like this one here. So we really monitor closely on what's happening in the market with our clients, but also what you can research with doing proper market analytics and market research. And this informs basically your strategy. And at Simtra, I think for us, this was a trigger point to say, like, we need, on top of our high-potency manufacturing capabilities in Germany, also the same capabilities in North America. And we launched an investment in North America to have Simtra being able also to offer commercial manufacturing of cytotoxic drugs in North America.
Interesting. So let's move on and talk about partnerships. That's what this conference is all about. Why are strategic partnerships so important in the CDMO space? How do they add value for Simtra?
Great question. From my perspective, the injectable drug manufacturing space is a very complex space, and it is almost impossible to have a capability in all these different areas. Think about, for example, API manufacturing. Think about the value chain going then into drug product manufacturing, going into packaging, device assembly, clinical trial management, etc. There are so many aspects that have to be covered. There is no company really being able to address that in a good way. You maybe can do bits and pieces, but being really good in everything, I would say, is a pretty impossible journey. That's where partnership and strategic alliance come into play. Because if you combine, for example, like two market leaders in their respective fields, you leverage the strengths of the two players and really offer a seamless end-to-end solution to a client, but coming in this case from two companies, two market leaders instead of, let's say, one company. But that doesn't happen overnight. So if two companies want to partner, want to enter a strategic partnership to provide an end-to-end solution to clients, they need to do a lot of prep work. You need to define how a project should be managed between the two companies. What are certain milestones, handover steps? What are key contact people that have to work with each other? And only if that's properly managed and prepared, you're really ready to offer a solution to a client.
That's interesting, because I hear this sort of one-stop shop CDMO or integrated CDMO sort of coming up more and more, and it seems to be more and more popular. So you sort of disagree with that strategy at Simtra?
I don't think I wouldn't say I disagree, but the question is, like, what do you define as a one-stop shop in the injectable manufacturing space? Because it really starts already with API and go back with secondary packaging, device assembly, and that's a pretty long chain, which I would see currently nobody being able to offer that in a good fashion.
That makes sense, thanks. So injectable manufacturing, obviously, as you say, is very technically demanding. You're running multiple products on the same lines. There's no room for error there. What does client collaboration actually need to look like for that to work?
Yeah, I think you said that. There's no room for error. So quality always goes first. That's like paramount. That's like a given that has to happen at any time. After that, I would say, comes early involvement. I think it's ideal if CDMO and the client can work together from the very early phases of the development process. Because, for example, as at Simtra, we can offer formulation development, we can offer lyophilization cycle development, we can recommend container closure systems that fit well to the drug and the manufacturing process. And if you start at that early phase, you can make sure that what you want to produce, for example, during clinical, can be seamlessly executed, and even the scale up into large commercial manufacturing will be very seamless. And that at the end translates into time to market. Because if you have a seamless development and upscaling process, you are getting to the market very quick. The second aspect is certainly flexibility. We talked about the geopolitical environment, risk mitigation. Having a CDMO that can provide the same services from different locations is a very big benefit. Having then on top of that the appropriate capacities to address customer and client needs is another key benefit. Last but not least, I think it always comes down to communication and transparency. the better the two parties work with each other, communicate with each other, the more you can avoid misunderstandings, delays, or any other issues.
Tell me more about that transparency point. How do you ensure that? Is that, with data sharing and visibility, or what does that transparency mean at Simtra?
I think it can have multiple levels. First of all, I think there needs to be a very close relationship between stakeholders of both companies, so that at any time they can have a direct exchange about needs, challenges, etc., to be aligned and stay informed. I think the other aspect is, imagine there's a scenario where, for example, the API supply by the client gets delayed for whatever reason. It's good to have that information in a timely manner, because then we can reschedule and we can make sure we don't lose slots, so that at the end the customer still gets its product, potentially a bit later due to the delay of the API supply, but it's not like a completely lost slot or production opportunity.
Interesting. So tell me, if you could change one thing about the way pharma companies approach CDMO partnerships, from the CDMO perspective, what would that be?
Yeah. I wouldn't say I want to change it, but I think what would be good to reinforce is really to think about how can CDMOs and pharma service providers create value for the customer and the client, and finally also to the patient. I'm just picking back on an example I used before. Think about, for example, development. If a CDMO and a client can work together closely on joint development, this will allow seamless scale-up and seamless commercial manufacturing, which means the product gets faster to the market, which is a big value for clients. Think about risk mitigation, enough capacity. If that's guaranteed, because both parties have talked closely to each other how, for example, the volumes would develop over time, there will be no bad surprises, which means we will support nicely a client in his market penetration, which again, I would say is significant value for a client. So that would be just two examples to explain what value creation means from a CDMO standpoint.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. And so on that and the strategic partnerships we were talking about earlier, would you say the partnerships you have at the moment are truly strategic?
Absolutely. And I would say you always have, businesses which are more transactional, and that's sometimes because the product is already generic or the product isn't anymore in the strategic focus of the client. But of course, every product has a very long lifetime, and that's why it just continues. But everything that is, in the growth phase, that gets ready for clinics, that gets ready for market launch, is absolutely strategic and will be supported in that way from both sides, and should be supported from both sides in that way.
Absolutely. So finally, I'm going to give you a tricky one. What's the hardest part of your job right now?
I think the hardest part is really to provide capacity to clients in these days. I think there is a lot of demand because there's also this change, as we discussed before, triggered by the geopolitical changes and the risk mitigation. So customers historically being sourced from Europe asking for production capacity now in North America and vice versa. Balancing that with the available capacity is a challenge. Fortunately, at Simtra, we're in the good situation that we invested proactively in capacity and are now pretty good position to address that.
And actually, because I've heard different opinions on this, the capacity constraints in sterile manufacturing, like some people say that they're caused by GLP-1s. I've heard also different. Do you think that the GLP-1s have been the main contributor to the capacity, or is it something else?
I would say the GLP-1s and the high demand for GLP-1s and the boom have been part of that, and certainly are still driving it to some extent. But overall, when you look at the biologics market, it's still growing. The pipeline in biologics is growing. Think about new modalities like ADCs, bioconjugates. That's a growing dynamic. That all requires injectable manufacturing capacity. And it also requires capacities and capabilities which are specialized. So not everybody can do that. And just having it on the paper doesn't mean you can do it. I think it's better to work with partners like Simtra that have long-term experience in dealing, for example, with new modalities like the ADCs and bioconjugates. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Mike, thanks so much. Really interesting conversation there. Appreciate you joining us.